This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about him.
Hello and welcome to episode 135 of Slick Talk, What to Expect When You're Extending. I'm your host, Blackstone Joe, and I'm glad you're here. Today's episode is all about the normal, the abnormal, and of course the in-between when you're extending those oil change intervals. Before I dive into the main event, though, I wanted to respond to a couple of questions left on the YouTube comments section. Thank you to all of our listeners for checking the show out, especially those taking the time to leave comments, ratings, reviews. All of that helps us a great deal, growing the listener base, and also lets us know how you're engaging with that content. Beyond the average listener, we know that this show is also being utilized as an educational tool for automotive vocational programs out there, at least a couple of them that I've been made aware of. And that's all very cool, both that's happening and that people are taking the time to let us know how this show is being consumed. Please continue to engage however you would like to do that, whether that be leaving a rating or a review, sharing it with anyone you know that might be a gearhead or interested in what we do here at Blackstone. It's all very much appreciated. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about a couple of these questions left on the comment section. Again, this is in regards to episode 134. In that episode, we talked about a Prius engine, and one listener noted that they heard that these engines may not get hot enough to burn off moisture because they normally don't run very long. Have we seen any trends with these engines in your testing? As for trends in general, yes, we have a ton of data for Prius engines in our database. But in regards to moisture content, one thing about Prius engines, as well as really any modern automotive engine that you'll come across, is that you don't have to worry about these engines getting warm enough to burn off moisture, in the sense that moisture is simply not going to be there unless there is some ongoing issue. This goes for really any engine. Again, anything modern where it's been made in the last 30, 40 years, they simply aren't susceptible to moisture accumulating simply by the engine sitting. Moisture is really only going to be a factor for motors where there's coolant contamination providing the moisture. It's not simply going to show up there from the atmosphere. Modern day engines are sealed up in a way where you're not going to have that particular issue. That was mainly a problem for older engines that had open breathers where moisture from the atmosphere could accumulate. The only exceptions to the rule that I would like to point out is, of course, when it comes to aircraft engines, those can have moisture that get in because they are susceptible to whatever condensation is out there that has a chance to build up. You don't have to worry about that for just your average automotive engine that's, again, a modern piece of equipment. You won't have to deal with that whether it's a Prius or otherwise. The water is really only going to get in if there's a coolant leak. Next, we have a comment about intervals. Specifically, should they be measured in hours, not mileage, given that hybrid engines are not always running while miles are building up? Does that make sense? Yes, it does. And not just for Prius engines, however. If you have a truck that does a lot of idling, hours would be more accurate for you because miles on the odometer don't take into account the engine simply running without accumulating mileage. So there's always going to be some use not recorded on the odometer. As such, hours technically are the most accurate way to go about it. So if you have a truck that does a lot of idling, or if you're inclined to measure hours for really any engine you have, feel free. Just keep in mind we can only track one or the other. Oftentimes, folks will put hours and miles on their oil information slip. We can only use one, but it's whatever you prefer. So if you would rather use hours, and again, that can be more applicable depending on the use that you're asking of the motor, we can certainly do that. We can track hours, or usually folks just put miles, and that's fine too. Keep in mind, it can really depend on the operation as for what's best for you, but keeping track of hours is never a bad way to go about it, especially if you're doing a lot of use not recorded on the odometer. Okay, now let's talk about what to expect when you extend those oil change intervals. This topic is thanks to a customer reaching out after having sent a couple of samples in. They asked, if I change the oil at 5,000 miles or 10,000 miles, should I expect a big difference in the numbers? Okay, so I have a lot to unpack here, and I want to start by approaching this in fairly general terms. So here's what going from 5,000 to 10,000 miles might look like in most cases. Iron will probably be double. Otherwise, metals should be really about the same. If they're not, and they go up, it may be because the oil was run too long, or there could be other factors, such as contamination driving up metals. Additive elements like calcium, magnesium, they should be about the same, but their effectiveness will decrease as the miles accumulate, something you'll learn about if you ask for the TBN, which is the total base number. The TBN will likely drop over the course of the longer run, and if it's a diesel engine, soot will probably increase. Also fair to see more insolubles. Those are solids that form as the oil is exposed to heat and use. But that's another reason to actually test the oil to see if they're high. If they are, it means the oil filter was used up. You probably shouldn't run longer. Ideally, the viscosity will stay put. But again, that may not occur due to a host of factors, and the oil being run too long could be one of them. But a viscosity is something that can change, and an analysis will help inform whether that's due to extending the oil change interval from 5 to 10,000 miles, or if there is something else like contamination impacting the physical properties. So here's what happened for this engine in particular when it went from 5,000 miles to 8,000 miles. Those are the two samples the customer had on file, and in the 8,000 mile sample, the first one they sent in, metals simply looked fantastic. All of them lined up well compared to averages. There was no contamination to speak of. Viscosity was in range. Insolubles checked in at 0.1%. That's a low reading because it usually takes 0.6% to indicate the oil filter was used up on our end. Then, for whatever reason, they dropped the oil change interval to about 6,000 miles, specifically 5,758. So in this second sample, metals largely stayed put, which is a great example of how things should be in an ideal scenario. You only really expect to see fluctuation in the iron level, at least on our end. Iron tends to track with use because the majority of wearing components are steel. So that's why other metals tend to be stable, as they were in this case. Aluminum stayed at 4 ppm. Chrome, 0. Copper checked in at 2 parts per million. Lead, 0, which made sense because the bearings are aluminum in this case. Really no significant change in any of the metals we test for. There was, however, a bit more iron in the oil, specifically an increase of 3 parts per million. That's not what we expect. So again, a good reason to always actually send in a sample to see what's going on. But at the same time, it's not bad. It's that gray area I mentioned earlier. It's not normal, but then again, calling this abnormal would be wrong in the sense that it's simply not abnormal wear for the engine type in general. Another thing I want to keep in mind is that it's only the second sample from this engine. We're still in the early stages of building trends. We don't quite know what a typical wear profile is for this Mercedes in general, specifically an M270. So while we normally anticipate a decrease in that iron level, we're still getting to know the engine, and we also don't quite have a feel yet for use the engine sees. If, for example, that 8,000 mile sample included quite a bit more highway mileage, and then this 5,758 mile sample was more along the lines of short trips, frequent idling, all the things that tend to accompany in-town driving, let's say, then it wouldn't necessarily mean that there's a problem cropping up, just that the engine is wearing a bit more due to differences in operation. Now, if this customer went with a 10,000 mile sample as they initially asked about, we would look for stability overall. We would want to see these stable trends continue. However, it's hard to know what to expect necessarily when it comes to that iron level, given the fact that it had gone up a little bit after a shorter run. Ideally, it would stabilize on a per mile basis as they continue to put more samples in the file. Again, they're in those early stages where there can be some bumps in the road in terms of metals necessarily behaving in a typical fashion. However, aside from that iron level, everything else was really going according to plan. Going beyond the metals, the physical properties were right in line with what we would like to see. Insolubles, for example, went from 0.1% to a trace level in that second sample. Less solid material after a shorter run is exactly what you want to see. Furthermore, there wasn't a significant difference in the add of elements, which were exactly on par with the first sample, as they should be, given the fact that, again, these elements don't decrease, it's that their effectiveness can decrease. Something the customer could have learned about with a TBN. In this case, they didn't add on a TBN, but otherwise, the physical properties are really right in line with what should or what we expect to see in two samples with varying mileage on them. On the whole, should this customer be interested in extending to 10,000 miles from the mileage they've attempted already, I honestly would be all right with it. Despite the fact the slight increase in iron is something of a setback, it's far from a cautionary one because this level still looks really good for the engine type and the mileage on the oil. In general, though, I think this is a great example of how you just need to go to the data to see what's happening, because there was one result that did vary from the expectation. Fortunately, though, we know that that fluctuation wasn't related to an issue with the physical properties, nor was there any sign of contamination or issues otherwise that would speak to there being a problem influencing the wear profile that we're seeing so far. Not to mention, this is a good example of why building trends is crucial, because tracking slight fluctuations here and there, the ones that are normal to see, that lets you know that the engine is in general keeping a stable wear profile. This Mercedes looks quite good overall in both samples. And if it continues to behave like this, with only those small changes, that just provides more evidence not only of the oil change intervals being doable, but the engine wearing well as a whole. And of course, you can see whether or not you need to be proactive in your maintenance plan in addressing signs of harmful contamination. Fortunately, there are none of them in this case. So to wrap up, there are certain things you can anticipate the longer you run the oil. If it's a diesel engine, probably going to get more soot. Reasons why you might want to look into additional testing if you're a diesel engine owner. I would encourage adding on soot testing to see how sooty that oil is becoming, adding on a TBN to see if the active additive package has been depleted. But even if there are, let's say, typical results, not every engine is going to adhere to the norm. Just because you anticipate only a slight increase in the iron level doesn't mean there can't be other things going on the longer you run the oil. You simply need to see if there are issues going on a microscopic level, and an oil analysis is the only non-invasive way to see if there are signs of a problem cropping up. And of course, just because one engine is capable of a 10,000-mile run doesn't mean that's the best fit for all of them. We're merely bringing up one example, but oil change intervals and what's ideal, not only are they relative to the engine type being sampled, but also the individual owner and what they're asking of that engine. Not every M270 is going to see the same operating conditions on a day-to-day basis, so taking into account the driving you do is just as important as the actual miles or hours on the oil. Sure, you might find a little bit more metal during a longer run. Some engines, though, may outperform that. Maybe they make less metal on longer runs than their counterparts. And if they are, an oil analysis is going to help inform as to why that could be. Hopefully this episode has told you quite a bit about what can happen when you run the oil longer, what would be an abnormal result of running the oil longer, and of course, figuring out the why of it all. If you have any questions, though, don't hesitate to reach out. Send us an email at bstone@blackstone-labs.com. Put Slick Talk in the subject line. If you have any questions about this episode or topic ideas for another, feel free to let us know. This is Blackstone Joe, signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.